For over 20 years, I suffered from migraines, and I thought that I was going to have to live with them the rest of my life. But I found a solution, and I have not had a single migraine for almost a decade. I'm going to explain my own journey in this video. It's not a self-help video. It's not an offer or guarantee of a cure for others who are struggling with migraines, but I'm just going to tell you my story because it relates to the purpose of my channel, which is all about clear thinking, problem solving, decision making, and discovering those literal and metaphorical treasures in our lives. So it all goes back to my 20s. I think it was already in my early 20s that I was beginning to experience a number of headaches, and I would just take a couple of ibuprofen and that would be fine. But as I got into my late 20s, the headaches got more and more intense. I learned to just bear with them. I tried to find coping mechanisms, but they were having a pretty significant impact on my life in the way that I thought. I loved to read. I loved to write. I would read 2 books every single week, even when I was struggling with migraines. But I had no idea what it was like to actually live migraine-free. In fact, at that point, I didn't even know that these were migraines. I just thought I had bad headaches, and I honestly thought that's what life was like for everyone else. I heard other people talk about having headaches, and I would just respond by, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I have those too." And I didn't realize that what they were experiencing and what I was experiencing were completely different things. So when I turned 28, I went to a doctor and I began to explain that these headaches seemed to be getting worse, and I'm not sure what's going on. I remember growing up as a kid and I would have these sinus headaches on occasion, and the doctors would tell me that it was indeed a sinus infection or something of that sort, and so I just assumed that it was sinus related. But the doctor explained to me that what I was experiencing was something different, and it was the first time that I ever heard a doctor diagnose me with migraines. He wanted to give me a prescription for medicine, but I was not ready to do that at that point in my life. I never really liked medicine, and I had already taken far too much ibuprofen in my life to try to deal with these headaches, and the thought of getting a prescription medicine just honestly scared me a little bit, and so I avoided it for a number of years. But the headaches kept getting worse and worse, to the point that when I was in my 30s, I was having 3 to 5 migraines every single week. I had more time in the week with a migraine than without it. And at this point, I had been a teacher for a number of years in K-12 schools, and at this point, I had moved to higher education, and I was a professor, and I was moving into administrative roles. I had started a blog that became one of the top education blogs on the internet for over a decade, and I would do that work and write in the evenings. I was studying and taking classes at different universities, working on a couple of graduate degree programs. So I was still actually pretty productive, but I'd do that all in between the migraines. I'd have a terrible migraine and I'd have to endure it sometimes and make it through the school day or the work day. And then I'd just crash at night and I'd wake up at 10 o'clock and I'd cram in my work from 10 p.m. until 3 a.m. to fall asleep for maybe 3 or 4 hours and wake up and try to take on the next day. Of course, that just perpetuated the headaches. It was painful. And it got worse and worse to the point that it was impacting my mood, and I think it was impacting my relationship with my wife and my friends and others, because when I didn't have a headache, I just had to get my work done. And I didn't have as much time for relaxing and enjoying hobbies and other things of that sort. And so this just went on and on, like I said, for over 2 decades. But I'm a problem solver. I like to try to solve problems. I like big puzzles and riddles. And as much as I was in pain and suffering and struggling, I decided that I was going to treat this as a challenge. I was going to find a cure for my migraines. And so I proceeded to read voraciously and try to explore every possible solution that I could. I talked to my doctor about it, and I even got sent to a specialist, to a neurologist. And at the end of the day, what I heard from my doctors was that a migraine is not curable, but it can be treated. And they recommended that I go on some different prescription medications, but still, I was holding out. I took a prescription, and I would use it when I was in a really difficult position, because there were several occasions where my migraines got so intense that I had to go to the emergency room. I just could not tolerate the pain, and I had to go and get some kind of special treatment. And of course, when I would go in there, they would give me very powerful medications to help address the pain that I was going through. But I went through this again for years, and I was still committed. I can find a cure for this. If I find the right approach, I think I can figure this out. And I did everything. Every possible strategy that you can find on the internet, I'm pretty sure that I used. I went through acupuncture and massage therapy. I made sure that I slept well. I started getting my sleep in order. I exercised a huge amount. I tried to stay well hydrated. I managed stress in my life. I did all of those different things that I could. And it helped at times, but then the migraine would come back. I tried to catch up on my work after having that headache. I would just crash and then get caught up in this cycle of headaches for several days in a row, or maybe get a day respite and then it would come back. And I remember just dreading going anywhere. I used to do a lot of speaking. At this point in my life, I was starting to become a more well-known public speaker and keynote speaker, and traveled throughout the United States and even to other countries. But honestly, every time I went, I was afraid. I was just scared that I was going to get stuck in some hotel room with another migraine that was debilitating, or I was going to have to speak to a group of 4,000 people, and right before I step on stage, that ice pick in my eye would come out and I wouldn't be able to communicate clearly. It was obvious to those around me when I had a migraine that was coming on. In fact, they noticed it before I did. They could notice something in my eye, in my face, in my demeanor, in my language. I would struggle to find words sometimes when a migraine was coming on. And this was a long, painful cycle. So, how did I figure it out? I'd like to say, because this channel is all about clear thinking and problem solving, that I had the perfect systematic plan, and I jotted down a list of 75 strategies and systematically went through and tested each and every one until I came up with a solution. But this time I didn't. But what I did do is I didn't give up. I kept looking. I kept believing that I can find some way to at least manage the headaches better. I did try more prescription medications, but I hated the way they made me feel. It didn't feel as painful as the migraines, but I was worried about what they were doing to my body, because I would get these strange side effects after the medication. And so one day, I was at the grocery store. I came across a book that was in one of those shelves at the counter, not where you find the most reputable or scientific literature typically, but it was a book called The Migraine Miracle by a neurologist who struggled with migraines himself. And I thought, well, I've tried everything at this point. What's an extra $10 to buy this book along with the rest of my groceries? So I grabbed the book and I put it down and I bought it alongside everything else. I took it home that day, and lo and behold, that night I had a migraine. I was hoping to read it, but I could not concentrate enough. And I went through the migraine and I got over it in about 18 hours or so. I'd often have this burst of energy after I got over a migraine. I'm not sure if that's common, but for me, it was just this euphoria of not having the pain, and I was very productive. And of course, I'd often overwork after that time, and that could cause another headache. But this time, I picked up the book, and I read it through from beginning to end in a few hours. It was a really simple concept. And what he basically suggested is that in the literature, in the scientific literature, there's not a really obvious cure, and that most doctors just settle for trying to manage migraines. And yet he used a metaphor. He described a migraine as a monster. And he suggested that the key to defeating this monster called a migraine is to not feed it, to starve the monster. He also used this metaphor of weights and balloons. And weights are things that you do that pull you down into the migraine risk area. And balloons are things that pull you up above that and increase your chance of avoiding a migraine. And some of them were the flip side of one another. A weight could be not sleeping enough or poor sleeping habits, and a balloon could be sleeping well. But he also suggested the way our brains developed over the years is that some people's brains seem to be more sensitive to a modern diet, that the more ancient diets that many people ate seem to be better suited for certain people. He suggested that one should avoid gluten and should have a more high-protein diet, should avoid high sugar consumption, and a number of other things of that sort. And I had something that I could work on. So what I did is I took a list in the book of all of the weights and the balloons, and I did every single thing that was supposed to be a balloon, keeping me above the migraine threshold, and I got rid of every single weight that was supposed to pull me down into the migraine threshold. And I still had a couple of migraines for the next week or two, but they weren't nearly as intense as the ones before. And then within a month, I was headache-free. I think it might have been in that next 3 to 6 months, I may have had 1 or 2 more migraines, but they were quite mild, maybe more to the category of a headache. And now, I'm talking to you. At the time I'm recording this video, I'm over a decade free of migraines. I have not had a single full-blown migraine in a decade. I do largely practice a gluten-free diet and a high-protein diet, and I keep the sugar content low, or whenever I have something sweet, I make sure I accompany it with protein. But I follow the things that are in this book still on a regular basis, but I can still cheat on some days if I feel like I'm doing well in most areas. And I just can't explain enough how big of a difference this made in my life. If you go back to those first 3 to 6 months after I applied the strategies from this book, I had never felt more productive in my entire life. I remember thinking one day, is this how normal people live? This is incredible. I was so productive and I had so much energy that I literally wrote and published 3 books in the first 12 months of being migraine-free. Up to this point, I've published 9 books, and I've written almost 1,000 articles in terms of blog posts and other articles and those sorts of things, because writing is something that I love. But my productivity was off the charts after figuring this out. And I was experiencing the joy of what is, I guess, how normal people live. And I think this has something to teach us about clear thinking, problem solving, and decision making. I'm going to share 3 simple lessons that I learned from this that are relevant for anyone, whether you're someone who's going through migraines or you're just trying to figure out how do you solve another big problem, maybe in your life, or solve a problem in the workplace or something of that sort. One is, I'm not saying that we don't respect doctors and medical professionals. In fact, we absolutely should, and they have a lot of great wisdom. But the standard solutions that are being presented may not always represent the breadth of options available to us. And I learned that in this situation. Keep in mind that I'd gone to 4 or 5 doctors, all of whom said that what happened to me was essentially impossible or highly unlikely. But there was someone out there who was looking at the problem from a different perspective. And he was able to come up with a new way of looking at the same problem. He didn't do any massive research or double-blind study to try to determine what the cure to migraines would be, but he did study the breadth of literature and pull it together and organize it in a new way. And that new way offered people a low-risk strategy that they could try in their life that might help them out. I find that a really powerful lesson. Sometimes the best solutions and the best problem solvers are not necessarily the people that are going out there and inventing new things, but they're simply looking at the existing knowledge in new ways. They're organizing it in new ways. And that is a lesson that I think we can all take with us that's valuable. A second one is this. I admit to getting to a point of near hopelessness. I struggled with some measure of depression, and just dissatisfaction about the quality of my life when I was struggling through the pain of frequent migraines and missing out on opportunities with family and work and wanting to accomplish more than I felt like I was able to while going through this pain. But what I'm grateful for, despite all of that, is that I now have a reminder that some problems take a long time to solve, and there's still hope, even after 2 decades of struggling with the same problem. In fact, a lot of big problems that we try to tackle, they take that long. There's a treasure hunt that went on in France for decades before it was solved, just in the last few years. People persisted, people explored. It even became a pastime for families in France to go out to the countryside and look for this hidden, buried owl. But over decades, it was actually discovered. Sometimes we are going through problems, maybe in our own lives, maybe problems we're trying to solve, maybe it's a game we're in, and sometimes it takes longer than we think it should. I once had a chance to talk to a woman who worked overseas on the project of starting an international school in a communist country, and she was, I believe, in her 70s at the time that she spoke. And she spent well over a decade in that country building relationships with the government to try to get the trusting relationship necessary to get their permission to start this school. And she was speaking years after this school started. And she said something of this sort, and I'm paraphrasing it. I may have said it in another video differently, but she said, many of us quit too soon, sometimes only after a decade or so. And I remember when I heard her speaking, I thought, man, I sometimes want to quit after minutes or hours or days or weeks. And this is someone who persisted with a problem for over a decade, and it paid off. Now, it wasn't guaranteed that it would pay off. It could have turned out differently. But persistence matters. I think that even if you don't solve that big problem, that having hope and being optimistic and seeking solutions is going to create a better situation for you, even if you never get to the solution, that you can find some real meaning and value in striving to find a solution to the problem. And let me just leave you with one last lesson that I've taken away from this whole multi-decade migraine experience. After having discovered the solution to my own migraines, I have never been more motivated to take on new problems. Now that I know that sometimes it takes 2 decades to figure out a solution to things, when I find myself in the muck and mire of a problem or a struggle or situation, I find myself more hopeful than I've ever been, because I have seen problems that take decades to solve. I've experienced it myself, and maybe, just maybe, with a couple decades of effort, I can solve the next one. I hope you find this useful. I look forward to your comments.